Yes, Anthea, please.
I'll just respond to the one issue on conditionality. I don't actually think I said anything about conditionality in my remarks, but I would say you're right. I agree with you that there still is conditionality. I wouldn't call it conditionality. I would call it, mutual benefit. I think it's more in those terms. So, but for sure, your example about the China and the UN and the Pacific Islands, for example, there's definitely interest. Mutual benefit has conditionality kind of woven into it. It's just different language.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. I'm also going to pick up on the conditionality thing, and it was clumsily expressed on my behalf, so I'm sorry. In fact, Paolo and I were just finessing it. Yeah. I mean, if you look at Greece, Greece has had an iron fist and an iron glove, old-fashioned IMF conditionality of the worst sort. But I think I do want to row back. I do want to say that some of the old-fashioned, sometimes the north-south thing is expressed very simplistically. Oh, northern donors do conditionality and we don't. Oh, come on, So I think that's what I would contest. And one reason, perhaps India and China don't have to do so much strong economic conditionality is because the World Bank's doing it for them. So you can protest against conditionality, but be very pleased that the World Bank is dropping capital controls and in Africa and elsewhere. So there's a bit of free riding as well on multilateral-led neoliberal conditionality. So I think it's just a more complex situation than the simple thing that the North's pushing policy conditionality and the South is holding up sovereignty.
Thank
you. I follow Emma's on the question of conditionalities. There are two caveats, though. I think that the very idea that we have international financial institutions imposing structural adjustments everywhere, this ended. We have a structural adjustment, we must have fiscal discipline and so on and so forth, but this is actually imposed by the market. It's rating agencies and so on and so forth. It's embedded in the market in a way. The problem is, as you said, social environmental regulation, and there's no conditionalities regarding social environmental regulation anymore. Not even the World Bank. The World Bank has a bunch of safeguards, but they are actually betting on country systems. So they, in a way, these institutions are adopting a southern vocabulary of non-interference. Which is really, really, really risky in that sense, and that may be a problem. This is when you see things happening in many, many countries at the same time. Something's happening at the systemic level. I mean, if you look at the Amazon countries, 5 Amazon countries. Not to mention Venezuela, which is melting down, but at least 5 Amazon countries are flexibilizing the social environmental regulation at the same time. In terms of mining, it's a mess, and this is for attracting investments, and these investments are being baked by public money, by financial institutions, and so on and so forth. So that's a big problem, I think. On the global governance, I don't think I was optimistic. On the contrary, I'm really skeptical about the ability of these institutions actually to provide any kind of order and regulation in a way. On the BRICS IBSA thing. I think there is one issue about the BRICS, which is related to one side effect of the BRICS effect. The BRICS effect discentered the entire world order, but there is another effect that we didn't mention or we touch very lightly here, which is the fact that there is an effect up on the South. What we call South now has changed, and I'm not sure. I'm sure that we cannot call South as a homogeneous entity. I think we never could call it as a homogeneous entity, but we cannot call in any sense. And this fragmentation of the South is generating something very, very interesting, which is emerging recipients. Which is precisely the case of Brazil and if I'm not mistaken, South Africa. We are emerging recipients. We are not emerging donors anymore. We are becoming more and more clients of China, and in the future, I would say, India, 1 week from now, probably. And this is a problem for the ability of this group to deliver something meaningful internationally. For the BAPA, I don't know, Pilani, who is going to win this new battle. I'm afraid the LDCs will lose. I hope Jorge can help us to save it. But I do think that there is one key agenda, as I mentioned before. One key agenda for BAPA is the bringing back responsibility, and together with the responsibility, there is one agenda that I do think it's critical, is leaving no one behind. It's how to make South-South cooperation work for leaving no one behind. How to make development cooperation work for leaving no one behind. I think this is the critical agenda, is how to tie development cooperation to internationally agreed goals. And on the end of donorship, I think this is actually a narrative move which would allow donors to use ODA money to bring the private sector in. This is something that Andy mentioned before. There is this enormous trend among DAC, OECD DAC countries to get public money, public funds related to ODA. Ante mentioned some facilities here, and bring this money to, this ODA money to the risk or to offer guarantees to the private sector engagement. To do that, we must have to adopt the language or the vocabulary of mutual benefits. The idea of the old idea of donorship does not fit in this new narrative. Thank you. Sorry for taking so long.
Yes, I will be very brief because, as I said, we'll have my opportunity tomorrow. I think both IPSA and BRICS are an idea that is beginning to take material form. It's nowhere like the European Union. It's no substitute to the United Nations system. It is somewhere, if we want comparisons, it's before the 1962 Rome Statute that established the European Union, but it will not go that way because it will not build the kind of institutions that the European Union did. The New Development Bank is brand new. It's just made its first outlay of resources towards renewable projects. The second one is happening now. Everybody should be focusing on it, from civil society to thinkers, anybody, and smack the place into proper South and South cooperation. It's all brand new. But the responsibility in terms of the future is enormous. We're talking about 42% of the world's population. If we fail this time, we're failing you. So it's your duty to keep us on our toes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just
Professor,
want to
yes.
respond to my former student's question about, will the LDCs opt out of the South regime itself because they feel shortchanged or discriminated by the, to use Amitabh's phrase, a power South. I know he's used this phrase before, the power South as in like the dominant creamy layer within the global South. Are they actually, in a way, reproducing cycles of exploitation of the weakest who are at the bottom of the ladder? I think the opt-out, if you look at it one way, if you look on a climate issue, for example, already they have, because you look at the small island nations, they have formed a coalition of their own that challenges China and India and Brazil. And the biggies already. And likewise on different issue-based areas, you might find coalitions of the weakest. But I think they will be more effective in getting heard if it is transcontinental, meaning Pacific Island nations and Caribbean nations are actually quite far, as you know. But if you have an Atlantic/Pacific coming together, then you have like 30 or 40 or more nation states with a voice in the General Assembly. So you may have to go beyond geographical notions of small states and their articulation of their group interests. We need a kind of a pan or a global level of coalition for them to really be effective and to persuade the power South, to use Amitabh's phrase, to behave and to not to forget where they came from.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think I would like to thank those who have given very important questions and the answers that our panelists and special commentators have given. I have nothing to add to that, but I would like to mention that we have to remember that South-South cooperation means cooperation between countries which are also developing, and they have dual roles. See, if you look at poverty, concentration of in numbers is mostly in developing South, is not the LDCs. So I think it's developing South providing assist and support to the other countries. And from that perspective, I think the issue of conditionalities, and I'm very glad that over these 4 daily dialogues, we are now getting into the nitty-gritties and the challenges, and that's why the issue of risk that you have mentioned, Anthea, that what are the implications in terms of the accumulating debt servicing liabilities, the responsibility of our countries to use South-South cooperation in a judicious manner. And all these are becoming very important because we are talking about billions of dollars. India has provided Bangladesh, for example, 3 lines of credit, $1 billion, $2 billion, and $5 billion. In total, $8 billion. China is providing $25 billion. So all these, if we cannot really use these in an appropriate manner, these will create, the bottom line and the balance sheet will show up. And also with regard to conditionalities, for example, the Indian line of credit, during the first line of credit, the one conditionality was that 85% of the procurement will have to be from India. Now, that has its own implications. We have been fighting against, North-South tide aid for 40 years. And now this, but because, and that's the, challenge, that it is developing country providing, support to other developing countries. Developing countries where there are so many, difficulties which they are facing themselves. So one will have to keep, I think, that in mind. The other is that, I was in Buenos Aires and we have Argentinian friends around, and the WTO couldn't come up with any ministerial declaration. New issues are coming up. Mega RTS, where we are not members, but the rules will be set in the mega regional trading arrangements. So all these are also, as I was mentioning, both push factors and pull factors are there. So from that perspective, a deeper understanding about South-South cooperation and the risks and the rewards is so important. And so from that perspective, I think all of us will be leaving this room, much enriched and with many insights from the panelists, special commentators, and also the very important questions that were put forward. So thank you very much, and on behalf of all of you, I would like to thank our panelists and commentators, and on behalf of them, I would like to thank you.
And I must thank you, Professor Mustafizur Rahman, on behalf of organizers, for helping us manage the time. It's 1:30, and friends, we would have lunch break for 1 hour. This room is called Silver Oak. Just above that is Jacaranda. And the one below in the basement is Magnolia. We have laid out lunch here outside and also upstairs. Those of you who are interested in following the discussion on health, science, and technology can come back to this room after an hour. And those who are interested in agriculture may go upstairs in Jacaranda. And Magnolia would hold discussion on trade and investment. So enjoy your lunch. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the post-lunch session. My name is Sinusha Naidu. I'm with the Institute for Global Dialogue. I know this is a bit of a hard session after lunch, so we'll try and be as informal as we can, and it's going to be really interesting because we're dealing with the health sector and looking at South-South cooperation within the sectorial level of health. So we have a very, very interesting panel with me on the dais who are going to provide some very informative and interesting analysis. I'm going to possibly close the session at 4:45, given that we missed about half an hour. But of course, you know, that all depends how we go in terms of discussion. So before I forget, I want to just also ask people to put their cell phones on silent, just in case we don't want to interrupt the speakers or the discussion. Having said that, let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Andrea de Mello Souza, who's with the Institute for Political and Economic Research, IPEA in Brasilia, in Brazil. And he's got the floor. I'm going to give the panelists about 15 minutes each, and thereafter we'll open up the panel for discussion. Andrea.